By 1910, one count put the toll on 11th Avenue alone at 548 dead and 1,574 injured. Men, women, and children struck by freight trains running at street level, hauling coal, milk, and beef through blocks built to hold neither. This was not one accident. It was a schedule. It ran for decades, and the city's answer was to hire men on horseback to ride ahead of the locomotives waving red flags by day and lanterns by night, because building a fence was never on the table. Not a single bad crossing, an entire avenue turned into a rail yard with sidewalks attached. Today, a studio apartment on those same blocks starts at $3,795 a month. The average runs close to $4,950. Men in tailored coats walk the pavement where a 19th century police captain once told a reporter that hell itself would be mild by comparison. And in doing so, gave the neighborhood the name it never shook. This is the story of the 11 blocks that earned that name, and what it cost to make people forget why. Chapter 1. A farm, a creek, and a line on a map. Before there were gangs to name it, there was no name at all. The land west of what would become 8th Avenue belonged to farms, and farms do not need reputations. The largest of them ran under the Hopper family, and it was not a modest holding. Andreas Hopper's acreage stretched from today's 48th Street to nearly 59th, from the Hudson shoreline east to 6th Avenue, a rough diagonal slab of pasture and woodlot that a man could walk in an afternoon and call his own. Cows grazed where a rail yard would later kill children. Corn grew where the tenements would eventually stack families 4 to a room. None of that was written yet. It was still just Hopper's land, quiet and unremarked. Threading through it was a creek, and creeks, unlike farms, tend to become problems. The Great Kill was tidal, which meant it rose and fell with the Hudson twice a day, spreading itself thin across a boggy lowland called Reed Valley before finding the river again near 42nd Street. This was no ordinary stream but a tidal estuary in miniature, brackish and mosquito-thick, useless for building on until someone drained it. Farmers tolerated it. Surveyors, when they eventually came, did not. A creek that flooded on schedule was a creek that stood in the way of streets that needed to run straight and dry. And by the 1820s, the city had already decided that straight and dry mattered more than whatever had lived in that marsh. So in 1825, the city paid $10 for a piece of it. $10 to John Leake Norton for the farm he called the Hermitage, bought for one purpose: to cut 42nd Street through to the river. It was not a generous sum even then. It was barely a sum at all. A rounding error dressed up as a transaction, the kind of number that only makes sense once you understand the city wasn't buying land so much as buying permission to erase what was on it. The Hermitage went the way the Great Kill would go, the way Reed Valley would go, the way Hopper's pasture would eventually go, under a grid. And once the grid existed on paper, something had to be built to fill it. That something arrived in 1847, and it arrived on rails. The city granted a franchise to run freight tracks directly up 10th and 11th Avenue, at street level, no separation from the carts and pedestrians and children who already used those blocks to get from one place to another. Coal came down those tracks. Milk came down those tracks. Beef came down those tracks, headed for the slaughterhouses and the markets downtown, and the locomotives that hauled it were never asked to slow for anyone standing in the road. The decision took a farm's worth of open land and threaded a working freight line straight through the middle of it, at the same elevation as a child's chest. West of 10th Avenue, the land filled in fast, and it filled in ugly. Tanneries went up first, then slaughterhouses to feed them hides, then plants that rendered animal fat down into tallow, then soap works to use the tallow, then breweries, then the coal yards and rail yards that fed the whole grinding machine. Not one industry, an entire chain of them, each one existing because the last one produced a byproduct too foul to move anywhere else. The smell settled into the blocks and stayed. The farms were gone entirely now. Hopper's Fields, the Hermitage, the marsh that used to be Reed Valley, all of it paved, piped, or paneled over with brick. The land had a shape. It had rails and stink and a grid that didn't care what used to grow there. What it did not yet have was people enough to fill it, and that, within the decade, was about to change. Chapter 2. A famine fills the grid. The people who filled the grid came from Ireland, driven out by a famine rather than drawn in by opportunity. The potato crop failed across the country starting in 1845, rotting in fields that had never grown much else, and tenant farmers with no other food source had no other choice. Ships crossed the Atlantic loaded past capacity, not a trickle, an actual flood. Irish families arriving with whatever fit in a trunk, moving up the island for ground cheap enough to claim. Many found it on the west side, on blocks where Hopper's cows had grazed a generation earlier and built what they could afford. Shanties along the Hudson docks, thrown together from scrap lumber and tar paper, close enough to the rendering plants to smell them and close enough to the river to work its slips. It was not a neighborhood yet. It was a landing zone. The city around them was doubling on a schedule of its own. New York's population doubled roughly every decade between 1800 and 1880, a pace that outran housing and sanitation both. Landlords answered the shortage the way that turned the fastest profit, subdividing existing buildings, throwing up new ones built for density rather than light, 5 and 6 stories over airless interior rooms, and calling the result a tenement. By 1890, the arithmetic had settled into something close to permanent. Of roughly 1.6 million people in New York, some 1.2 million lived in tenements. On the west side, as everywhere else, the shanties of the 1840s had given way to brick blocks holding 4 and 5 families to a floor. The famine generation and their children had simply moved indoors, into something worse. Jacob Riis went looking for proof of that, and found it on West 38th Street. Riis was a police reporter turned reformer with a camera, and by the late 1880s he was working through the tenement districts documenting what landlords preferred left undocumented. The apartment he photographed there had no window to the outside, no shaft to move the air, and no connection to a working sewer. 3 absences that between them defined most of what a tenement was. Families cooked in it, slept in it, raised children in it, and paid rent for the privilege on a schedule as fixed as any uptown lease. Riis wrote the conditions down and printed the photograph. The neighborhood he was describing did not yet have the name history would give it. On September 22, 1881, the New York Times ran the words "Hell's Kitchen" in print for the first time, attached to the same blocks holding Riis's windowless rooms and the shanties before them. Where the paper got the phrase was never settled. One account traces it to the slaughterhouses and fat rendering plants already thick along 10th Avenue, the same industries that had defined the district's smell since the 1840s, the theory being that a place could be named for what it did to the air around it. By the 1890s, a police captain working the precinct had taken up the phrase himself, using it with reporters as a plain description of his beat rather than a figure of speech. The name stuck the way the smell had, and stuck for the same reason. Nobody found it worth correcting. None of it, the famine, the tenements, the name in the Times, had anything to do with the freight tracks running up 10th and 11th Avenue at street level. Those had been laid down in 1847, before Hell's Kitchen was Hell's Kitchen, and by the time Riis climbed tenement stairs with his camera, they had been running for 4 decades without a fence, a gate, or a bridge between them and the people now crowding the blocks around them. The trains had killed before. They would keep killing on a schedule nobody interrupted, and before long, someone would start keeping count. Chapter 3. Death Avenue. Someone had started keeping count. and the count grew for decades before it stopped shocking anyone. By 1910, one tally put the toll on 11th Avenue alone at 548 dead and 1,574 injured, an accounting that stretched back to 1847 and never really closed. A name added here, an amputation logged there, year folding into year with no ledger anyone thought to shut. The dead were not a single catastrophe. They were arithmetic. A child chasing a ball into the roadbed, a driver whose horse spooked at a whistle, an old woman crossing where she had crossed for 30 years without incident until the year she didn't. Each one filed separately, each one gone from the papers by the following morning. The trains kept the same schedule the neighborhood kept. Freight cars rolled through at street level, at the height of a child's shoulder, sharing the pavement with push carts, stickball games, funeral processions, and the ordinary foot traffic of people getting from one tenement block to the next. There was no elevated track here, no trench, no wall separating 40 tons of moving iron from whoever happened to be standing in its path. The railroad had never built one. The city had never demanded one. What the railroad built instead was a man on a horse. The men were called West Side Cowboys, and the title was not decoration. An actual saddle, an actual horse, a rider paid to trot a length ahead of every freight train that came down the avenue. By day he waved a red flag. By night he swapped it for a lantern. That was the entire warning system. One horseman, one signal, repeated block after block, hour after hour for the length of the run, which is to say a man on a horse was the plan. A boy playing stickball did not have time to read a red flag. A cart horse spooked by a train whistle did not have time to read a red flag. A widow carrying groceries across the avenue at dusk did not have time to read a lantern swinging 50 feet up the block. The cowboys rode the same route every day, knew the same crossings, recognized the same faces, and still the ledger kept filling, because a rider with a flag cannot outrun a train any more than a flag can stop one. The neighborhood gave the street a name for what it was. People stopped calling it 11th Avenue and started calling it Death Avenue, and the second name outlasted the first. Nobody built a fence. Nobody built a bridge. The arrangement held for so long that it stopped reading as an emergency and started reading as weather. Something the street simply did, the way it did smoke and noise and crowding. The practice would not last forever, though the ending was still decades off, and it would not come from petitions or outrage, but from something else entirely. A shift in cargo and economics, not a change of heart. That story belonged to a different chapter. This one belonged to the Count. What the Count did not measure was what the danger taught the ones who survived it. Boys grew up on these blocks with the freight line running past their front stoops like a fact of nature. And a street that could kill you for stepping wrong also trained you early to read it, to know which crossings the cowboys covered and which they didn't, which hours were safe and which weren't, which corners belonged to whom. It was an education nobody enrolled them in and nobody could opt them out of. Some of them would take what the avenue taught them and put it to uses the railroad never intended. Chapter 4. The Gophers Take the Block. By 1890, that education had a name and a roster. Marty Brennan, Stumpy Malarkey, and Newburgh Gallagher took the boys who had grown up reading the freight line and the cowboys and the danger hours and gave the whole arrangement a structure. They called it the Gopher Gang, after the cellars and basement dives where members slept and met and hid. And within a few years, it was no longer a loose understanding among neighborhood kids, but an actual criminal enterprise with leadership, territory, and a business model. The street had trained them. Brennan, Malarkey, and Gallagher organized them. At its peak, the Gophers held the ground from 4th Street to 42nd, from 7th Avenue to 11th, a stretch of the west side wide enough to swallow docks, tenements, saloons, and rail yards whole. They did not hold it quietly. Burglary paid, so did armed robbery, street muggings, prostitution, and illegal gambling rounded out the ledger, and together the four functioned less like scattered crimes than like a diversified income, run by men who treated the neighborhood as a resource to be worked rather than a home to be kept. The territory was the asset. The rackets were the yield. Into this came Owen Madden, born in Leeds, England in December 1891, the son of Irish immigrants who crossed to America and settled him, still a boy, on the same blocks the Gophers already ran. He was not an import from some rival underworld, and not a curiosity dropped in from outside. He was an actual product of Hell's Kitchen, raised on the same corners, taught by the same freight line, absorbed into the same gang that had absorbed everyone else worth absorbing. The Gophers gave him a name to grow into before he had grown into anything else. They called him Killer. The nickname stuck longer than most men's tempers do, and Madden wore it through a rise that outpaced his age. He was young when the Gophers took him in, and not much older when the gang's own hierarchy began to bend around him, the way ground bends around something heavy enough to sink into it. In time, the neighborhood gave him a second name to match the first, grander and stranger than a street thug's title had any right to be. They started calling him the Duke of the West Side. Not every Gopher stayed a Gopher. Late in the 1890s, a former member named Goo Goo Knox broke from the gang entirely and built a rival out of a house on Hudson Street, close enough to the water to smell it. He called his men the Hudson Dusters, and the name carried its own reputation before long. The Dusters' leadership ran on cocaine binges as routinely as other gangs ran on whiskey, a habit that made them unpredictable in exactly the way that got men killed on the docks. The split was not friendly. The Gophers had lost a piece of themselves, and the piece had taken up arms across the street. What followed was a fight over the same ground both gangs had learned to want: the docks, the blocks, the freight and cargo moving through the West Side day and night. Gophers and Dusters bled each other for it for years, two gangs sharing one bloodline and one grievance, close enough in origin that the war between them read almost like a family argument settled with knives. Neither side won cleanly. Both sides kept fighting anyway. Eventually, the arithmetic changed. Gangs from the east side pressed in on territory both the Gophers and the Dusters considered theirs, and old enemies discovered that a shared enemy was more useful than an old grudge. The alliance held long enough to push the combined territory out to 13th Street, further than either gang had managed alone. Madden, by then, was no longer just a name inside a gang roster. He was about to become a name the whole city would learn to use. Chapter 5. What the Street Became. Oni Madden went into Sing Sing a Gopher and came out something else. He was paroled in 1923, and within weeks he had put his money into the Club Deluxe, a small Harlem room that had until then belonged to Jack Johnson, the former heavyweight champion of the world. Madden did not linger on the symmetry. He renamed the place, brought in his old friend Frenchie Demange as partner, and called it the Cotton Club. This was no speakeasy with a stage bolted on. It was a venue built to be watched. Duke Ellington played there, Louis Armstrong too, and Lena Horne sang from the same stage. The room filled every night with people who had never heard of 10th Avenue, who could not have found Death Avenue on a map, who had no reason to know that the man collecting the profits had learned his trade dodging freight cars 100 blocks south. Madden did not advertise the connection. He did not need to. The money moved the same way it always had for him, quietly, through people who owed him something. And now it moved through jazz instead of through beer. He had started as a name inside a gang roster. He ended as a name printed in newspaper columns about nightlife, about music, about the parts of the city that considered themselves furthest from the docks. The distance was the whole point. Picture 10th Avenue on a Monday morning in March, 1941. The date is the 24th. The cobblestones are still there, though fewer of them than in Madden's day, patched over in places with asphalt that never quite matches. A young man named George Hade, 21 years old, sits the saddle at the head of a freight train, the red flag in his hand more habit now than warning. Behind him, 14 cars, and inside them, oranges. Not coal, not beer, not lumber. Fruit, crated and cool, riding north the way 10,000 other loads had ridden north before it. The bell on the lead horse is gone by now, phased out years earlier, but the rhythm is the same one that had governed this stretch of pavement since before Hade's father was born. Hooves first, then the low grind of the wheels, then the whistle, short and flat, swallowed almost immediately by the buildings on either side. A few pedestrians glance up. Most do not. A practice that had needed its own uniformed riders to keep from killing people has become, by 1941, close to invisible, absorbed into the texture of a street that had learned to expect it. No one on the avenue that morning knows this is the last one. There is no ceremony. Hade walks the horse to the far end of the run. The oranges are unloaded, and within days the railroad quietly ends the mounted patrols altogether, the danger judged no longer worth the wage. A practice that had shaped the daily rhythm of an entire waterfront for the better part of 60 years closes not with a hearing or a headline, but with an empty saddle and a stable that stops filling it. What had once needed a boy on horseback to keep from becoming a tally of the dead simply stops, the closing as quiet as the routine it ends. 16 years later, the street reappeared somewhere else entirely. In 1957, West Side Story opened on Broadway. Leonard Bernstein wrote the music. Stephen Sondheim wrote the words. Jerome Robbins built the choreography, and Arthur Lawrence built the book, and all four of them reached for the same raw material. The turf wars of Manhattan's West Side gangs, the very blocks where the Gophers and the Hudson Dusters had once drawn lines nobody was supposed to cross. The Jets and the Sharks danced across a stage built to look like the streets Madden had grown up fighting on, and audiences who had never smelled the stockyards or heard a freight bell paid to watch it. The theater turned the old grudges into choreography. It could not yet know how soon the real thing, unset to music, would return. Chapter 6. The Name They Tried to Take. The music stopped first in the theaters that had never touched a real knife. Then, in August of 1959, it stopped on West 46th Street, where a playground built for children became the site of a stabbing that left two 16-year-old boys dead before the ambulances finished their run. 9 teenagers were charged, most of them affiliated with the gangs, whose rivalries had, months earlier, been set to choreography a few blocks east. No song accompanied this one. No overture, no reprise, no curtain call. Only 2 names added to a list the district had been keeping since before anyone thought to set it to music, and a courtroom docket that would grind through the fall. The details did not need embellishment, and the era's papers, working the story hard, did not much try. A playground, a summer night, 9 boys arraigned, 2 boys buried. The choreography had promised that violence, staged correctly, could resolve itself into a kind of order, a rumble with rules, a rivalry with a resolution. West 46th Street offered no such resolution. It offered a police report, a grand jury, and a neighborhood once again fixed in the public eye as the place where boys killed boys over ground that belonged to no one. The reaction came from the people who had spent years trying to make Hell's Kitchen sound survivable. Later that same year, the West Side Association of Commerce moved to strip the name outright, proposing that the district be called Clinton instead, borrowing the word from DeWitt Clinton Park a few blocks north, and hoping the borrowed respectability might stick. It was a name with no blood in it, no fire company, no legend about a rookie cop and his sergeant. It was a name a landlord could put on a lease without wincing, a name a business could print on a storefront without explaining it to out-of-town customers. The association did not invent the idea from nothing. They invented it from the West 46th Street playground, from the summer's arraignments, from a decade of headlines that used the old name as shorthand for exactly the kind of thing that had just happened there. The campaign was not shy about its reasoning, not a cosmetic adjustment, an actual attempt to sever the district from its own record, to let commerce operate under a name unstained by knife wounds and gang rosters, and a century of tenement grievance. Real estate listings began to favor it. Some churches began to favor it. Some residents, tired of explaining the name to relatives upriver, began to favor it too. Hell's Kitchen had never had a mayor to defend it, never had a charter, never had anything but the stubbornness of the people who lived under the name and kept using it anyway, in kitchens and stoops and union halls. Regardless of what the association printed on its letterhead, 9 boys stood accused of killing 2 boys, and the neighborhood that produced all 11 of them was handed a public relations answer instead of a public safety one. It was cheaper. It photographed better. It required no new precinct, no new playground supervision, no reckoning with what the docks and the tenements and the decades of neglect had actually produced. Only a new name, offered up like a coat thrown over a stain, patient with the hope that no one would look underneath it. The papers kept the old name in their crime blotters even as the association kept the new one in its correspondence, and the district went on being called 2 things at once, neither of them settling the argument. It would take years before that argument resolved one way, and the resolving would not happen in a courtroom or a boardroom, but on the sidewalks, one stubborn conversation at a time. For now, the city's attention had already begun drifting elsewhere, not toward what to call these blocks, but toward what to do with them, and a man with maps spread across a desk downtown was starting to ask a different question entirely. Chapter 7. The Man with the Maps. The man with the maps was Robert Moses, and the question he was asking downtown had nothing to do with what the neighborhood called itself. He wanted to know what stood on the land, and how fast it could come down. Post-war urban renewal moved through Hell's Kitchen the way it moved through a dozen other working-class districts across the city, treating block after block of tenement housing as an obstacle rather than a home. The buildings that came down were not abstractions. They were walk-ups where longshoremen and their families had lived for 2, sometimes 3 generations, and when the wrecking crews finished, those families did not come back. The Port Authority bus terminal rose where some of that housing had stood, a concrete anchor at the district's southern edge, and its construction did what the old gangs never quite managed on their own. It thinned the population by design rather than by violence. Moses did not carry a gun or run a rackets book. He carried a plan, and the plan was more efficient than either. Displacement, in this telling, is not a footnote to the neighborhood's gang history. It is a precondition for it, clearing ground and scattering people in a way that left the old block-by-block loyalties with less to hold on to. The empire the Gophers and the Dusters had once split among themselves was already smaller by the time anyone thought to measure it again. Into that smaller footprint in the 1960s came Jimmy Coonan, building something new out of what remained. He called it, or the papers would come to call it, the Westies, and it inherited the old Irish grievances without inheriting the old Irish scale. Coonan did not aim to control 40 blocks. He aimed to control the docks, the construction sites, the bars, whatever cash still moved through a neighborhood that had lost most of its people and most of its industry. It was a gang built for scarcity, and it fought like one. In 1977, Coonan settled the question of who ran the West Side the way these questions had always been settled here, with a killing. He arranged the murder of Mickey Spillane, his last serious rival, and he did it with help from the Gambino family, a partnership that would define the Westies for the rest of their existence. Not an independent Irish power, but a subcontractor to an Italian one. A prosecutor who later worked to dismantle the gang summarized its internal logic in a single sentence: A would kill B, then C would kill A. 8 murders were eventually tied to the crew with certainty, alongside extortion rackets that reached into the construction of the Javits Convention Center, another piece of the same rebuilding wave that had razed the tenements a generation before. And through all of it, the gang's membership rarely climbed above 20 men. 20 men, controlling what was left of a district that had once answered to armies. The city, meanwhile, had drawn its own line against the bulldozers. In the mid-1970s, it created the Special Clinton District, a zoning designation that barred the demolition of residential buildings between 43rd and 56th Streets. Not a gesture, but a wall, built on the warning a 1969 city planning report had already sounded about what unchecked redevelopment would do here. It was a defense of the housing that had survived Moses, drawn up by the same government that had once cleared the way for him. The neighborhood that could not settle on a name for itself had at least settled, provisionally, on a boundary. The gang did not survive the decade that followed. By the late 1980s, Coonan's enforcer, Mickey Featherstone, sat in custody on a murder charge and made a decision that ended everything. He turned on Coonan, convinced his own boss had traded him to the Italians to save himself. The Westies came apart from the inside, informant testimony unraveling a crew too small to absorb the loss. It closed out something larger than one gang's run. It closed out a full century during which organized crews of one ethnic makeup or another had governed these blocks by force, an arrangement stretching back to the Gophers, and now, finally, with no successor waiting to take it up. The blocks the Westies left behind were quiet in a way the West Side had not been in 100 years, and quiet blocks, this close to Midtown, were exactly the kind of thing developers had been waiting for. Chapter 8. The Inventory of What Remains. The quiet did not last, and it was not meant to. In 2011, the city passed the West Clinton rezoning, a plan that pushed mixed-use residential development west to 11th Avenue, covering the blocks between 43rd and 55th Streets. The same blocks where the Westies had once run their crews, where longshoremen had once lined up at the shape-up, where tenement families had once stacked 3 generations into 4 rooms. The zoning maps did not mention any of that. They mentioned floor area ratios and permitted heights. The paperwork developers had been waiting for since the docks went quiet and the piers rotted into the river. Towers rose where the slaughterhouses once stood. Towers rose where the gangs once staged their wars. Towers rose along the avenue where nobody with money had wanted to build for 100 years. The waiting was over. Just south of those blocks, on the old rail yards that had swallowed generations of freight, Hudson Yards climbed out of the ground in glass and steel, a private city for people who would never need to know what the neighborhood used to smell like. The median condo there sold for close to $4.75 million, a number that would have meant nothing to families who once paid rent by the week on 10th Avenue. The new towers had views of the river the tenements never had, elevators the walk-ups never had, doormen where there had once been no locks worth trusting. Hell's Kitchen did not become Hudson Yards. It stood beside it now, block after block, the old grid pressed against the new one. The rent followed the towers north. Today, the average rent across Hell's Kitchen runs near $4,950 a month, the same number that opened this story, and a studio built for one now starts at $3,795, dollars more than some of those tenement families once earned in a month. The math has not changed since the hook. It has only had time to settle in. The 2020 census counted 49,758 people living in Hell's Kitchen, more than 13,600 above the 2010 count. And the neighborhood grew more diverse with every arrival counted. Immigrants filled the blocks the Westies left behind. Then families with money filled the blocks the immigrants filled. And the turnover did not stop with any single group. A later report has suggested the growth reversed, though the figure has not been confirmed the way the census once was. Hell's Kitchen had never been a neighborhood that held still long enough to be counted the same way twice. It had only ever been a neighborhood in the middle of becoming something else. At 52nd Street and 11th Avenue, DeWitt Clinton Park still stands. The same 6 acres that gave the 1959 renaming campaign its name. The same green space the business association had hoped would replace Hell's Kitchen on every letterhead and every listing. It did not replace anything. More than 60 years after that campaign folded, the blocks around the park are still called Hell's Kitchen. By the people who live there, by the brokers who rent to them, by the signage on the restaurants that trade on the name instead of hiding from it. The New York Times gave the neighborhood that name in 1881, and no rezoning, no rebrand, no rise in rent ever managed to take it back. The campaign to rename the district after the park was not a compromise. It was a failure. And the park it was built around still stands at the corner where they tried it, unmoved by the argument made in its name. Today the park's gates stand open at dusk, and the low light catches the red brick of the row houses across 11th Avenue the same way it caught them a century ago. Before the docks closed, before the gangs, before the towers rose 2 blocks east. The sign at the entrance still reads DeWitt Clinton Park, cut into stone. The developers never had reason to replace because nobody ever needed to rename what had already lost. Somewhere past the glass, and past the old brick both, the river keeps moving the way it always did, indifferent to what the neighborhood was called.